So we're going to talk about skin disorders and skin healing in this unit lecture. So I want to look a little bit about nail disorders to start. This is going to be very quick. It's not going to take very long. So just some things that you might encounter. So this is a type of infection along the nail fold, which is the creases along the sides of the nails. And you can see how inflamed and almost like that crease is completely gone as it pushes up on the nail. You can also have bacteria trapped in the nail. So you can see the discoloration here. The nail is actually green. That's from bacteria that were in the nail bed being trapped in the keratinizing cells as the nail was forming. You also have fungal infections. So you can see where the nail is being discolored underneath and the nail bed is being disrupted because of fungal infection there. This is ringworm. So ringworm is another fungal infection, and you can see it completely disrupts the functionality of the nail. Like it completely prevents the nail from forming in places. Nail atrophy, this is where the nail is lost due to injury at the nail bed, and it can actually be permanent if the injury is severe enough. In most cases, though, once the damage to the nail bed is healed, then the nail will begin to grow back, but sometimes the nail is fully lost forever. This is an ingrown toenail, so you can see it is causing severe infection, and it's also causing pretty substantial inflammation as the nail is being pushed further and further into the skin of the toe. That's what an ingrown toenail means, is it means that the nail is actually growing into the flesh of the toe instead of grazing over the top. Here we have a vertical split, so the nail is no longer whole. It is actually two separate pieces here. Again, this is damage to the nail bed that causes this, and it can sometimes be permanent, although most of the time, like I said, when we have those kind of vertical splits, oftentimes once the injury is healed here, it'll be perfectly fine. Over thickening of the nail, this usually results from having too much keratinization in the nail bed going on. It just makes the nail really, really thick, but this can often be treated with medication. You can get white lines and spots. These are just caused by slight bumping of the nail bed during growth, so it traps an air bubble in the nail during keratinization. Bow lines, on the other hand, are horizontal lines that indicate malnutrition. Usually that means that there's a gap in the ability of the nail bed to produce keratinization, so it produces this line here. If you have raised ridges, so you can see these kind of vertical seams here, if those were actually, if you could feel them and they felt raised, that would be due to an iron deficiency. Melanonychia is where you have, we do not usually have melanocytes in the nail bed. Those are usually exclusively found elsewhere in the skin, but sometimes you end up with a single melanocyte in there, and it is pumping melanin into the cells that will be keratinized to make the nail plate. This is where the skin begins to grow over the nail, and usually this is the result of trauma to that skin, and so it starts to form scar tissue over the top of the nail. Peritecum inversum is where the skin doesn't separate from the nail. So the pink part of your nail, the skin and the nail are actually attached to each other. But once you get past the quick, what we call the quick, that line of separation between the like pink part of your nail into the white part of your nail, the nail separates from the skin in most cases. This is a genetic disorder where the skin does not separate but continues to grow along with the nail. So this can be kind of painful, and usually is treated by keeping the nails very, very short. You can have psoriasis. This is where the nail keratinization does not occur properly, and so the actual layers of keratinized cells don't adhere to one another, so they flake off of each other. And then we have MMA damage. So this is where you have damage to the pink portion of the nail bed that you can see, and it changes how the quick is oriented. You can have splitting layers, so the layers of keratinization can actually peel apart from each other. Vertical ridges. So this is sometimes the result of aging. So sometimes you have thickening of the nail that results in these vertical ridges. And then you can have a hematoma. This is where blood is trapped in between the keratinized cells, and you see this staining that looks like a bruise because you have blood trapped in there. And the blood will eventually the nail will eventually grow past the hematoma, but it will, and you will lose that, so it won't be permanent discoloration. I think, yeah, that's everything. So coming back here, I didn't really need you to, I just wanted to familiarize you with some nail disorders, but I'm not necessarily worried about you like being able to regurgitate any of that. I just wanted to kind of give you an insight into the fact that nail disorders are common. So let's talk a little bit about skin color disorders. And there are lots of skin color disorders that we're going to touch on. So the first one being albinism. So this is a condition where a person lacks the gene to produce tyrosinase. So remember we talked about tyrosinase when we talked about gray hair, and the fact that without tyrosinase we do not make melanin, therefore the hair starts to go gray with age because we prioritize tyrosinase for our skin over our hair. In albinism, you do not make any tyrosinase. So there is no melanin anywhere in the person's body. We also have vitiligo. Vitiligo is a loss of melanocytes in a particular spot. So the melanocytes start to die off and are not replaced. And this can spread. It can be progressive, where you get enlarging spots where you lack melanocytes. Keratinosis. Keratin is a protein that provides yellow color to the skin, and keratin is found in carrots and egg yolks, which is why those things are yellow to orange. And consuming high amounts of these foods can actually lead to this building up in the skin. So you can actually have carotene building up in the skin, and it results in a yellow tinge to the skin. However, this should not be confused with jaundice, which also provides yellow discoloration to the skin, but that is caused by a excess amount of bilirubin, which is a product of the liver. And you have so much bilirubin circulating throughout the body that it starts to deposit in the skin, causing the skin to yellow. But it also shows up in other places in the body. And when I show you pictures of jaundice versus keratinosis, I will kind of explain the differences. So this is a person with albinism. This person is actually one of the people fighting for albinism rights in Nigeria, where they are a member of parliament, and they were the first person with albinism to be a member of parliament. Here is vitiligo. You can see those places where they lack melanin. And like I said, this can be progressive, so you can lose more melanocytes over time. Here is keratinosis. You can see that distinct yellowing there. And just, I have hands that do not have keratinosis for comparison. So you can kind of see the differences in what those individuals' skin tones would normally look like. Jaundice, on the other hand, does provide yellowing to the skin, but we also see yellowing elsewhere, particularly in the eyes. The eyes are where we really determine jaundice, because you can see those bilirubin deposits start building up in lots of places, and you can really, really see it in the eyes. And like I said, I just threw in some pictures of individuals with like different skin tones, so you can kind of see one of the things we look for jaundice is like looking on like the soles of the feet, but really the eyes are the clear giveaway there. Other things that can affect skin coloration are the amount of blood vessels in the dermis, because hemoglobin provides a reddish color to the skin, and so that can really influence the way the skin looks. So if the blood vessels are dilating and allowing more blood to enter the skin, we call this erythema. This is where we have reddening of the skin. Whereas if we have constricting of the blood vessels in the skin, this provides a bluish tinge, and this is called cyanosis. So just throwing up some examples. This is erythema up here. These two individuals have that increased red pigmentation. And then down here, you can see that cyanosis, that blue tinge to the skin. So moving on to some other skin conditions. This is psoriasis. What happens with psoriasis is that the skin, remember, the outermost layer of the skin should constantly be flaking away as we lose those skin cells. With psoriasis, those skin cells don't detach properly, they don't loosen, and so they form these thick plaques or patches where the skin is really, really thick because those cells are holding on to one another instead of flaking away as they're supposed to. Eczema, also called atopic dermatitis. This is a immune response in the skin. So normally we have the skin protecting against bacteria, but sometimes the skin responds to possible infections by becoming itchy and swollen. And so eczema is one of those things where you see this happening, but there's no true cause. Like we're not finding a bacterium on the skin that's causing this. It's just becoming irritated. This is most common in infants as their immune system is kind of trying to adapt to their new surroundings, but this can occur at any age. So here's some eczema. Then we have acne. Remember that this is inflammation of the sebaceous glands. We talked about that when we were talking about them, and they can become blocked, and bacteria can be trapped in there, and then they can start to expand and become inflamed. We also know that hormone levels play a role in this because increased hormone levels also trigger increases in sebaceous gland activity. So because of that, we know that hormones can play a particular role in that. Testosterone is particularly prevalent at causing acne. All right, damage to the skin. So bruise formation. With bruise formation, what we've had is we've had a break in the underlying blood vessels, but the skin has remained intact. So the blood vessel underneath has been broken, but we do not bleed outside of the body. The blood remains inside. And so what's happening there is the blood is being trapped underneath the skin. And then as the wound heals, it goes through those stages of healing, and the blood cells degrade over time and are then reabsorbed into the body. But what happens when we have damage that breaks through the skin? So the skin is fully broken. So that's going to require scab formation in order to prevent active bleeding. So the stages of scab formation start with bleeding, and then the fibroblasts in the reticular layer are going to start producing a lovely mesh of collagen and some other fibers. And those fibers are going to trap red blood cells. And those red blood cells are going to form the actual scab. All of those red blood cells are going to get trapped, and then they're going to start drying out. And that's what's going to produce that plug that prevents bleeding from occurring. So once the red blood cells are trapped, they're going to provide that color, and then as they age and they die, you will see that discoloration from like red to brown. Underneath the scab, what's happening is the skin is being rebuilt. We're using fibroblasts to make, collagen fibers, and then as the skin heals, we push the scab out and just reveal brand new skin underneath. Depending on the severity of the cut, you may or may not have scarring. And the scarring may or may not be severe, as we talked about before in tissue repair. So, other ways we can damage the skin. We can damage the skin through hypothermia. That's what we call frostbite. This is defined as any body temperature below 35 degrees Celsius or below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. This is subdivided into 4 categories: mild, moderate, severe, and profound. And what happens is One of the ways that your body maintains body temperature when it's cold is it slowly cuts off blood circulation to the skin, because the skin, expels heat. So if it cuts off circulation to the skin, it can push blood back towards the vital organs in the torso. However, that does leave the skin with no blood, and blood is really how we maintain body temperature, because as blood flows through blood vessels, it's not frictionless. It's made up of a fluid, but it also has formed components. It has red blood cells, and those red blood cells, as they hit and move through the blood vessel, they have friction, and that friction generates heat. And so by turning off circulation to the skin, you're depriving it of its heat source. So what can happen is the skin can actually start to freeze. We can actually have ice crystals form in the cytoplasm of the skin cells, and that can cause destruction of the tissue, on top of losing its oxygen, which prevents it from maintaining its energy supply. Remember that all cells are doing cellular respiration all the time, and so by cutting off oxygen, the skin cells are eating through their ATP supplies. And then, like I said, we have those ice crystals that destroy the tissue. So these are the stages of frostbite. First, we have frost nip. Frost nip is painful. This is where the skin may become red or purple, where it's painful to the touch. Stage 2, superficial frostbite. This is where you're probably going to get pins and needles, and maybe when you start warming up, some of your skin will start peeling, almost as if you've been burned. And then we have deep frostbite. This is where we do not come back from. There is no way to heal this. With stage 1 and stage 2, once blood is reestablished to the areas, we can, salvage those tissues. But once we get to deep frostbite, those tissues are dead. There is nothing we can do to salvage those tissues. The only thing we could possibly do at that point is maybe do a skin graft to replace the skin. But depending on where on the body that deep frostbite has occurred, oftentimes they don't want to do that. So this is extremely detrimental. So some varying degrees of frostbite here. You can see the frost nip here, but you can also see the superficial here. And then you can see the deep frostbite here on these fingers. And you can see that here. This is some superficial and stage 1 frostbite over here. Other ways we can physically damage the skin is through burns. Depending on how much of the body's protection is burned, it could be life-threatening. Burns are incredibly dangerous because if the skin is no longer intact, you are now vulnerable to infection because your skin is your first line of defense. You also become massively dehydrated because the skin is your protection against loss of water. And so all of these things combined make recovering from burns a pretty long, involved process. So you probably know that there are classifications for burns. So we're going to focus on the first 3 classifications of burns, starting with first-degree burns. First-degree burns only burn the epidermis. There's mild pain, there's erythema because we have increased blood flow, because we have healing to do, and this usually will heal in 2 to 3 days. A mild sunburn is what would be considered a first-degree burn. Second-degree burns burn through the epidermis down into the dermis. So the dermis itself gets burned. When this happens, we sometimes see loss of skin function in the area because what happens is blisters form. And usually when we have a blister form, we're also going to see scarring. And as you remember from tissues, when we see scarring, we see normal functionality of the tissue lost. If there is no infection, the second-degree burn can heal in 3 to 4 weeks. It is vitally important not to burst your blisters, to allow those to remain intact, because that fluid is helping to heal the underlying tissue that has white blood cells in it. It also has hormones to help trigger things like fibroblasts to make reconstruction of the tissue occur. Third-degree burns burn down through the epidermis, down through the dermis, and into the hypodermis. Basically, in this case, the accessory glands and structures that we saw in the dermis are gone. They are completely destroyed, and these wounds are incredibly slow to heal. Usually, a skin graft is often required because we have lost the skin. There will be scar tissue here because, again, we're rebuilding the skin from scratch. So oftentimes there's a lot of loss of functionality there. This can be incredibly life-threatening because, again, you've lost that protective layer against infection and dehydration. There are 2 other classifications of burns. I'm not going to expect you to know them, but I do want to mention them. 4th-degree burns burn down to the muscle layer. So you lose muscle mass in these burns. So that's what characterizes 4th-degree burns. And then 5th-degree burns burn down to the bone. So you actually lose bone tissue, and generally the only way to heal a 5th-degree burn is amputation, because you've completely lost all of the structure there. When we want to calculate how much of the body is covered in burns, this is something, I don't know how much exposure you would have to this. This is something that they used to sometimes report on the nightly news. In house fires, they would talk about the victims of house fires being covered in like 45% of their body were covered in burns, those kinds of things. And since most people don't watch like the nightly news anymore, I don't know how much exposure you have to hearing that term of burn coverage. But this is how we calculate burn coverage, is we use the rule of 9s. So this is the way burn coverage is calculated. So the body is divided up into multiples of 9. And so we have the front of the chest is 9%, the back of the chest is 9%, the back or the front of the abdomen and the back of the abdomen are both 9%. The front side of the leg, of each leg, is 9%, and the back side of each leg is each 9%. Then we have the arms. The arms are unique in that the front side and the back side are 4.5%, and the front of the head and the back of the head are both 4.5%. And then that last percentage there comes from the groin. the groin is a single percentage of body coverage. So moving past disorders and damage, I want to talk a little bit about what happens to skin as it ages. So the biggest change that we see is in the subcutaneous tissue, otherwise known as the hypodermis. Aging people usually lose a substantial amount of volume in their hypodermis. This is often why it's one of the contributing factors to wrinkles, is they just don't have the same volume of tissue pushing out against the skin, combined with a loss of collagen, which results in a loss of elasticity in the skin, causing it to droop. The last aging thing that we see as it relates to the skin is loss of hair follicles. So aging can result in as much as a third of all hair on the body being reduced. This is sometimes referred to as alopecia due to aging, although alopecia can also be a much more drastic situation where you have the loss of all hair. But age-related alopecia is common, and usually it should only be about a third of the hair. And that will round out everything we're going to talk about with skin. And just make sure you're ready for that exam coming up.